Good evening. I'm David Cataforis, professor and chair of art history at the University of Kansas. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This acknowledgement recognizes Native Americans as traditional guardians of the land and the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. I'm pleased to welcome you to another lecture in our ongoing series, Intersections of Identity, Expression, Exchange, and Hybridity. The series asks, what constitutes identity? How do people navigate, form, and reform their sense of self? And how can the study of art and its history help us to consider the diverse identities expressed by visual culture and its creators? We seek to amplify the voices of scholars and artists whose work explores individual and collective identities, as those intersect with notions of the body, disability, gender, heritage, and race. The series is organized by KU's Crest Foundation Department of Art History and the graduate students of the History of Art, Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. It is sponsored by the Franklin Murphy Lecture Fund. We present it in partnership with the Spencer Museum of Art and KU Department of Visual Art. The graduate students and I are grateful to Art History Department Administrative Associate Joanna Ritt for all of her organizational help, and we acknowledge KU student Marlene Cerrone for the poster design. It's my honor to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Kelli Morgan. Dr. Morgan is a professor of the practice and the inaugural director of the curatorial studies at Tufts University. She's a curator, educator, and social justice activist who specializes in American art and visual culture. Her scholarly commitment to the investigation of anti-Blackness within those fields has demonstrated how traditional art history and museum practice work specifically to uphold white supremacy. Dr. Morgan earned her MA and PhD in Afro-American Studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and her BA in African American Studies from Wayne State University. She has held curatorial positions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, the Birmingham Museum of Art, and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Before joining the Tufts faculty, she taught at institutions including Wayne State University, the University of Michigan, and the Tyler School of Art at Temple University. In her teaching, she merges the classroom and the museum gallery to create anti-racist paradigms for how curators can actively address the complexities of traditional art history, community engagement, and scholarly innovation. She has lectured and published widely and is the author of the book, Black Feminist Visuality, African-American Women Artists and the Female Body, forthcoming this year from Wayne State University Press. Dr. Morgan's lecture will be followed by a question and answer period moderated by Maggie Brown-Peoples, who is a graduate student in KU's Museum Studies program and current academic programs coordinator at the Spencer Museum of Art. Her academic interests center on African-American history and culture in relation to Black artists. She's the Black Book Interactive Project Scholar of the 2022 cohort and was a Hall Center for the Humanities Summer Fellow at Lawrence's Watkins Museum of History. So please type your questions for Dr. Morgan into the chat in YouTube, either during or immediately following her talk. And I'm now happy to turn the screen over to Dr. Morgan for her lecture, Coloring Outside the Lines.
Thank you so much, David. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. It's really an honor. This is such a really interesting moment for me, and I'll tell you in a minute why. But first, I have to thank Bahita and Jiang Wang and Logan and Ru-Ying and Maggie, for the invitation. Again, such an honor and such a pleasure to be with you all tonight. So usually whenever, I talk about my work, or my practice, I talk primarily about my career trajectory, right? How I was trained graduately, all of my different experiences at different institutions. And this talk tonight is actually going to be a little different because I'm talking primarily about my personal experiences, how I was raised, my family, what the theme, right, of the lecture series, identity and hybridity and exchange. So the way in which my community and my sort of home life, right, my family life really influenced how I do the work, kind of how I got here. The other thing that's really interesting about tonight is, which was not actually planned, but the house that I grew up in, the room that I did a lot of this coloring in, I'm actually sitting in right now. This is the room that I grew up in as a kid that my mom has now turned into an interesting montage of things, including, a guest room. And I'm in the midst of writing another book that is tentatively titled right now, Museum Overhaul. And it's like my set of rules, that I apply in my curatorial practice. And tonight I'm going to read to you all, which I don't typically do, but the introduction, to that manuscript that, like I said, that talks a lot about my family. And again, all of the ways that my family has influenced how I came into the field. So I will start coloring outside the lines. So this may come as a shock to some, but becoming an art curator was never something that I really wanted to do. And this was not because I had no interest in art. To the contrary, I spent much of my childhood enamored with color, as the hues of the rainbow truly made my heart sing. Next slide. I would sit for hours drawing the color prism in various shapes. I owned a very deep stock of coloring books, sketch pads, color construction paper, and what seemed like 1,000 crayons. So you can see me here. So this is what my room used to look like. This room that I'm sitting in right now used to look like in 1986. And the picture's kind of cut off, right? But I'm drawing the rainbow and like grass, under it. The picture on the right side of the screen is me Christmas of maybe 1986. And this was such a major Christmas for me because I got these 2 ridiculous life-size coloring books, right? That I was super, super excited about. And I was very particular, right, about my coloring books and crayons. So Crayola was like a must, right? Because the other brands like Prane and Rose Art were like way too waxy for me. So almost every trip, to the grocery store or to Kmart resulted in a new coloring book of blank, cartoon images with a fresh set of crayons. However, my mom and I fought constantly about paint. And again, it's fascinating to be sitting here and I can still see the stains, of the paint that I spilled, for a number of years. Mom didn't play, right, about cleanliness. So my 6-year-old self, and channeling all the Jackson Pollock every time she bought me paint, caused a major, right, rift between the two of us. So about after the 9th or the 10th time, she found herself scrubbing paint off the floor, right? And out of my hair, or off my face or off, the desk that I'm working on here. Paint became like forever banned, from my little fingers. So despite my passion for coloring and painting, becoming an art curator was never something that I wanted to do, simply because it was not on the list of the things that I could be when I grew up. In fact, in my Black working class community, that list contained only 2 options: medical doctor and lawyer. And I chose medical doctor at a very young age. Next slide. Because I could never really pronounce obstetrics and gynecology. Whenever anybody asked me that proverbial question of, Kelly, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would respond emphatically, I want to be the doctor that delivers the babies and I want my own practice. And the look of satisfaction on my inquirer's face always pleased me because I knew that they were gratified by my forward thinking, right? Because here was a 6-year-old who didn't just want to be a doctor, right? She wanted to be a specialist with her own business. And I wasted no time. I spent hours in my sister's encyclopedias, who's 13 years older than me. So this is my sister, memorizing and studying human anatomy. Now in this picture, I'm actually I'm probably about 3. And the book that I'm reading is actually upside down, right? Because I would do this thing where I would read to myself based on the pictures, even if the book was like out of proximity. And on top of the fact that I actually couldn't read, right? At this point. Also, whenever I could, I would tag along with my stepfather, who owned a janitorial service that cleaned like urgent care centers and medical labs. But I would read and study the medical charts, that hung on the walls in the exam rooms. And I was really interested in the information that they provided. But as a 6-year-old, I really do think it was their color, right, that truly captured my heart. So I know you might be asking, like, how is a 6-year-old studying human anatomy? Next slide. So we were a true blue collar Motor City family. And the maintenance of our West Side, this, Detroit 2-family flat, required both my parents and my grandparents to work a lot. My mother, who you see here in the red shirt, was an accounting clerk for Henry Ford Health Systems. My dad, who's actually not pictured here, was a former foreman at Ford Motor Company. Like I said, my stepdad, owned his own business. And my maternal grandfather, who's the male figure in this picture, Floyd McCarty, was a factory worker until he injured his hand in a stamping machine. So you can kind of see where, he lost a part of his index finger. And when he encountered that, and I don't know if encountered is the right word, but when he injured himself in that way, he was like sort of relied on his genius, really, in mathematics and with numbers. So he wore a lot of hats. And in this regard, as a working class, man, he put that genius into gambling. Like, so he was a gambler, he was a number runner. He was a candy salesman. He ran a shoe shine stand at Ladbroke DRC racetrack. Next slide, where he sold candy, and did a lot of work that I think now, had to do with kind of grooming me for this job or in this career path, which I didn't think so at the time. He was really the patriarch, of our home. And like I said, he really had a way with numbers. So when he was a kid, my grandfather never finished school past the 6th grade. He grew up in a really rural western part of Kentucky, and he would hobo the trains, and because he was so smart with numbers, he would gamble, right? So now this is a 12, 13-year-old kid, right? Hoboing the trains, he would gamble across the Midwest, and he would bring his winnings, right, home to my great grandparents. And because of that skill, right, in gambling, he was really keenly observant. So he noticed right away that I was extremely smart and inquisitive. So much of my early study of anatomy and physiology was spurred by my grandfather. Next slide. He was more of like, I would say, a contemplative and researcher, right? Researching type of thinker. So he rated horses, so this is an image of him, at the racetrack after, betting on a horse that actually won. And he rated horses so well because he referenced text on like speed and velocity, equine anatomy, right? The winning rates of thoroughbreds from particular farms. So he would follow, right, particular horses. He was so accurate, right, that people from all over our community would pay, for his predictions. His lottery bets, next slide, never took place, without his dream book. And by no way am I like promoting gambling, but this is the 80s, right? And this was really, how he sustained us, as a family, outside of the little odd jobs that he worked. So for me, this mastery, with numbers was so fascinating to me. So I was really fascinated by these stacks of books that he had on like probability, because as much as he was really great, at blackjack and poker, he was also really, really good with dice. So even though his research skills and methodologies, really influenced my educational path because he was a voracious reader, the biggest impression that he had on me was our time reading National Geographic and Smithsonian Magazine. Next slide. So most evenings, like I couldn't wait, for him to get home because he read to me a lot. So this is an image of him like reading for me from actually a children's book. But he would read to me when he got home from the racetrack, because he would always bring a new magazine, home for me. So his clients, right, would leave magazines after he shined their shoes. And if it was something in there that he thought that I would find interesting or find kind of special, he would come home. And even sometimes if I was asleep, he would wake me up and say, Boop, like, I want to share this with you. And Smithsonian was always special because it was so thrilling. Because as a child, next slide, I didn't realize this, but now, right, I really do understand that he was employing what Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks calls learning as revolution. And he was introducing me to art history from a Black perspective that firmly placed our family and all of our visual and decorative objects in broader historical context. So why is this important? This is extremely radical because most students aren't introduced to the history of art until undergraduate, study at least. And even at that level, right, BIPOC people are usually stereotyped, right? We're basically non-existent within traditional art historical narratives, right? And visual analysis. So the fact that Granddad was literally discussing like Sevres porcelain with me, right, at 6, next slide, in relationship to my grandmother's love of dining and entertainment was extraordinary. Granny was infamous, for setting the dining room table and inviting friends and family over for elaborate meals. It was well known in our family how much she loved, Mikasa china, her Waterford crystal glasses. She bought them a la carte, from Hudson's, which was the primary department store, in Detroit in the 70s and the 80s. So as Granddad really read these curatorial articles with me, he would stop at particular image and ask, where have you seen that before, Kelly? Or doesn't your grandmother have something, like this in the dining room? And I would go, yeah, but Granny's isn't as squiggly, right? And I learned again much later that the difference in appearance between my grandmother's tea service and her, sets of china and Sevres porcelain or, 17th century American, decorative art was her preference for modern design. Likewise, Granddad discussed the magazine's presentation of American decorative arts, next slide, through my mother's collection of British willowware, asking me ever so presently, don't these things look a lot like your mom's blue and white stuff? 27 years later, next slide, when I stood in the threshold of the Birmingham Museum of Art's decorative art galleries, I instantly knew I was home and my family was right there with me. Unfortunately, I learned over time that art museums didn't feel the same way about me or people who looked like me, right, who hailed from poor working class backgrounds. And this was really important to me when I first started curatorial work, because that appreciation, for decorative arts just across the board didn't grow from art historical study or the study of material culture. It grew for me from my love of my mother and my grandmother, right, and my grandfather. And I would think all the time, if I have these stories, and these connections, and this sort of resonance, right, with these objects through my family home, I'm sure there are millions of other people, who are not the 1%, right, who are not on the board of this institution, who has similar stories, right, or who can make similar connections. So I really wanted to hone in on that, in my curatorial practice. And I've caught a lot of hell, right, for doing so. Because in most traditional art museums, working class Black folks are the help, right, not the curators. Next slide. That is until I walked through the door with all of my Black feminist critical race, mid-90s hip hop art historical Black studies training, right? conveyed with a thick Black vernacular and a profound Black autonomy, brought to you by the West Side of Detroit. More specifically stated, we could clean the bathrooms, right? We can greet the visitors, we can guard the galleries, but in no way are we supposed to be authorities on art or art history. And a lot of this comes from the fact, even when we're talking about, in my case, right, African-American art, this comes from the fact that institutions, they may be very interested in a particular era, right, of art history across, right, BIPOC groups. They may know a little bit about particular eras, particular objects, but they do not know and have deep, nuanced understandings of our actual culture. So from that point, I started thinking through Bell Hooks's Teaching to Transgress, which was one of the previous slides, right? Because in reading that book, I could identify with what she's explaining, like the way in which her teachers invested, in her, the way in which Black culture was so central, not to just how she was raised, but how she was actually taught. So she says she went to elementary school at a time, quote, when teachers knew our parents, our economic status, where we worshiped, what our homes were like, and how we were treated in our family, end quote. And I could really identify with that. Next slide. Because the majority, of my teachers at Horace Mann Elementary were Black women, like Bell Hooks's teachers too. And both they, as well as the Detroit public school system at the time, put extra time into those of us that they considered to be advanced students. First, they kept us together as we matriculated grade levels. And you'll hear this, right? Like the, Detroit public school systems or public school systems are so terrible. Depends on where you were and what era it was. Secondly, even though we fully participated in all of our classwork with all of our classmates, our teachers invested extra money, from their own pockets and extra labor to instructing us in higher levels of coursework than our current grade levels. For example, if rain, forced an indoor recess, while most of our classmates went to play in the gym or went to some assembly in the auditorium, that sect, of us that were considered advanced were stayed in the classroom or were held in the classroom to play academic games or to discuss essays and articles in Reader's Digest, National Geographic, and other sort of higher level, right, magazines. Still, along with nurturing our intellectual abilities, they ensured that beyond anything else, we knew how to speak up for ourselves and how to be authoritative thinkers. So when you read my work or, watch a YouTube video or you see me dragging some museum director on Instagram, right? A lot of that comes from how my elementary school teachers really taught us how to speak up for ourselves, and to speak up for what was right and to kind of what I like to say, stand on your own too, trust what you know. Like my grandfather, my teachers were doing something radical and that they were creating an in-depth learning community, for us that also function as a safe social unit. For my mother and my grandparents, this was a godsend because my teachers' efforts to ensure that I always had a safe space to lose myself in astronomy and the stars and human anatomy and the violin and the color wheel and what have you. By third grade, I graduated from crayons to chalk, right? Often stealing small pieces off the blackboard when I thought my teachers weren't looking. And I would take the chalk home, so excited to decorate the driveway, right? Or the brickwork on the side of our house. And my grandmother was never happy about my pastel masterworks in the middle of the driveway, right? Or along the side of the house. And she yelled at me constantly, Kelly, if you don't start writing all over my bricks, I'm gonna get you, And little did I know at the time, my teacher's Revolutionary Educational Act was purposeful because it was 1986. And the whiteness of crack cocaine had tremendously darkened the canvases in all of our communities and in most of our homes. That seemingly tiny white rock had hit our world like a nuclear warhead and took my father and countless others out in its plume of murder, mass incarceration, addiction, and arson. My classmates and I had not lived a full decade, but we have bore witness to the systematic destruction of our flourishing Black working class communities, and our teachers knew it. Therefore, they committed themselves to nurturing our intellect so that we would become scholars and thinkers and cultural workers, like I mentioned earlier, Black folks who used our minds. This was imperative for us as kids because we basically navigated urban war zones every day simply to get to school. To survive our daily treks, our teachers taught us how to quickly survive or how to quickly survey our surroundings, to trust our gut feelings, and how to read people's body language to create safe pathways out of potentially dangerous situations. And at the time, again, I had no idea how beneficial that was going to be, right? Navigating white art museums, right? And white institutions. So much of this ability, right? To read people, right? To trust your feelings. I tell my students all the time, what you think is happening to you is happening to you. Trust your intuition became really my saving grace, and particularly during my time at Newfields, because I was able to actually identify, right, the gaslighting, right, and the kind of psychological manipulation and abuse that goes on in art museums. My mother, next slide, ensured that I knew how to navigate what she used to call the other world, right? So this is where my mom's teachings really kind of coincide with my teachers. That other world was the white upper class and middle class society. So in 6th grade, she pulled me out of Detroit public schools, enrolled me in private suburban Catholic schools. And there I remained until I graduated high school. Through those years, her constant refrain was, you know what you know, what you know, which meant never let anybody invalidate you or your reality because you're a Black girl. Thinking about this always reminds me of a Facebook post by my dear friend, Ernest L. Gibson III, who's a literary scholar at Auburn University. And he says, quote, "Every year I tell my students that Black art requires a different way of seeing, a different way of reading and of feeling. I tell them that Black art carries the breadth and burden of being more than aesthetic, that Black art makes statements beyond itself. Every year I tell my students that Black folk have always had a different relationship with text, that text for us has always been fluid, mercurial, and dynamic. I tell them that Black modality is a thing unto itself." End quote. That modality, that manner of being and existence, is central to Black experiences and is a time-honored tradition of Black feminist thought. So this is why you see Audre Lorde on one side of this slide and my mother, right, on the other side. The relationship to text also holds true for the type of relationship that Black women have with the material, with the visual, and with both the scopic and pictorial arenas. My mother, like so many other Black mothers and grandmothers before her, had a vision of her girls being highly educated, and she worked as much as she could to create a space for that vision to manifest. She also worked that hard because our tuition was no joke. But as Audre Lorde exclaims, my mom made a commitment to language and to the power of language and to the reclaiming of that language, which was made to work against us. Because she was able to see beyond our class status, beyond our race and our gender, she spoke a successful future into both me and my sister that ensured that we had everything we needed to create, no matter what it looked like. Every day she reminded me in some way that I mattered because my voice mattered, because my life mattered, and what I wanted to be in life mattered. Next slide. Now that I spend the majority of my days teaching museum professionals how American art constructs whiteness, how traditional museum practices uphold white supremacy, and how to subvert and dismantle both, it's funny to remember my mom banning me in this room, from painting, and my grandmother yelling at me for drawing in places I was not supposed to. I think they both knew that I saw the world in living color and that I would do all that I could to get everyone around me to see it too. Even if I had to write and paint on the walls, right? And if you know anything about my career to this point, in my time at all of my institutions, I am very loud, right? I bring a lot of people with me whenever I'm pushing back, against something that I think is inherently discriminatory or just inherently wrong or kind of backwards. I don't think we can ever be banned, right, from what we are truly destined to do. And I've always had a passion for painting my own canvases in my own colors, no matter where I am. So ironically, coloring outside the lines is the perfect metaphor for how I employ my curatorial practice. And it ultimately speaks to why I'm writing this book. Next slide. As a Black curator and a scholar from a working class background, white institutions can be just as dangerous as my neighborhood was in the 80s. Narcissistic directors, tokenization, insecure colleagues, micro and macro aggressions, skin folk who ain't always kinfolk, and very little professional support is typically the norm for BIPOC scholars working in white institutions. And that's academic or museums. And it ain't easy to survive, right? Let me tell you, I hit a wall back in December, so I'm taking the summer off because I just need a minute, right, to recover from the last 2 years, right, of what I've experienced doing this work. But my upbringing, my elementary school education, my overall academic training, helped me figure out that white institutions and the white people that uphold their oppressive nature, because it's not all white folks, right? It's whiteness as a system. It needs to believe that working class, right, or poor BIPOC folks have no epistemologies, because that lie is the lens through which whiteness comes to understand itself as superior and elite. So accordingly, the Black Detroiter in me, right, works day in and day out to expose that reality as the underlying cause for white supremacy culture in art museums. This work ethic is also a personal virtue because terms like overtime and time and a half ruled the day in my life, right? So like I said, we're Detroiters, we were a Ford family. My father, for instance, went right into the factory, after, and so did a lot of my uncles after high school. So you could really make, right, and create a middle-class lifestyle, just by working in blue collar positions, at Chrysler, GM, and Ford, because of the unions, right? You got paid that much money. And so people saved, so even though my parents didn't go to college, my grandparents didn't go to college, because of my father's work, my sister and I, right, were able to do so. So in my family's estimations, if you put in the time, the diligence, and the hard work, you were guaranteed to accomplish your goals. And that's a very particular generational thought, because we know systemic oppression is a thing, right? So sometimes you can still do the work and still not get there. But overall, I hail from a family of laborers, right, in a city that literally worked its ass off to put the world on wheels. So the rest has been like that work ethic, right, has been my top priority for the past few years. And I share this because the idea of work and the various ways in which the act of work was carried out in my home, explained to me by my teachers, theorized by Black activists and feminist scholars, and clearly demonstrated by the Detroit labor movement, have all influenced the characteristic of my curatorial practice that I like to call overtime, or sometimes you'll hear me call it the extra work. It's the ways in which curators who are dedicated to caring not just for BIPOC objects, but BIPOC people and communities often have to work for months, both inside and out of the art museum, to build institutional, community, and educational structures that we need to support our curatorial work. The institutions aren't designed, right, to support the work that we do, right? So we have to be able to do that too, right? This ability to work around, under, over, and through traditional museum frameworks, which are inherently discriminatory to BIPOC people and communities, has been the key to my success as an art professional. And it's also the fundamental nature of my curatorial practice, meaning the ability to anticipate inequity, to outmaneuver discriminatory practices, and most importantly, the courage to identify and speak out against them is what makes my curatorial work so unique. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. That was powerful and really, really inspiring to hear those stories about your upbringing and how influential these family members were in your development, you know, as to become the scholar and curator and activist that you are today.
Thank you.
And Maggie can see questions that she can share with Dr. Morgan.
Again, thank you so much, Dr. Morgan, for your talk. I think that was very informational to learn about your biographical, like your history and basing your curatorial practices. So I have some questions in the chat that I'm going to start by asking.
Okay.
So we have Dr. Morgan, thank you for your talk. Could you speak more about your curatorial practice and some examples of the interventions you have helped making your museum work? And that is by Vignettes.
Sure. I'm trying to think if there's any, you know, I'm just going to link my website. So part of what I have done, right, you know, over my curatorial career is I've worked to really demonstrate how whiteness is constructed, right, in the museum space and through particularly American art history. So here, Vahita, can I share a screen now?
Yes, I am just gonna allow, yes, you can.
Okay. Because it's just easier for me to talk through, right, with a visual. So I started out, you know, really looking at, I'm an Americanist, right? So my specialty is really American art, primarily 18th and 19th century. So sometimes I'd say I get pulled into contemporary art, kicking and screaming, because I'm not actually a specialist in contemporary art, but I work through contemporary frameworks. So one of the things, you know, that I did, this is the second project that I worked on at PATHA, was unpacking this really famous Benjamin West painting. That's, as you can see the title down here, Penn's Treaty with the Indians. So this is all about, you know, William Penn and his treaty with the Lenape to create Penn's Woods, which later becomes the city of Philadelphia. Okay, long story short, this painting is allegorical, right? And it's tied, you know, very centrally, you know, very substantially to Philadelphia history, the history of William Penn, the William Penn's family, Benjamin West, and even like his ancestors. Benjamin West was a major or the major like American history painter. He was the biographer, like visual biographer of King George III, right? He was, you know, really well known in London, but he's from the Philadelphia area. So I was like, okay, you know, I don't want to necessarily take anything away from that. We don't have to erase that history. But do we realize that there's like 25 other people in this painting who had a whole lot to do with this moment? We're not going to talk about none of them people. We're not going to look at any of their ancestors, right? And without really doing a whole lot of, you know, archival work, I found a matriarch, right? Descendant from the Lenape. Her name is Cremona Mori. She was the house servant or house slave. She was eventually free of Humphrey Maury. Okay, so who was Humphrey Maury? Humphrey Maury was William Penn's bestie, right? So he's the first mayor of Philadelphia appointed by William Penn. Why Cremona Maury is so important is because she's pretty much the matriarch of the two major African-American families in colonial Philadelphia. And their stories are like absolute, well, now they are, because I've raised so much hell about it. But those stories were not included in the interpretation of this painting at all. Right. So I started doing what I call, so I kind of deconstructed this painting in that way. I deconstructed a lot of other pieces too. And I started doing these like critical race gallery tours, looking at historical work through the lens, right, of BIPOC folks. Because I always say you don't necessarily need Black art to tell a Black story, right? You don't necessarily, need Indigenous or Native American art to tell a Native American story. So fascinatingly, PAFA didn't actually want me to do or actually didn't allow me. They didn't allow me to do the tours on the days that the museum was open, right? So how I got around that. I was teaching at a lot of different schools around Philadelphia. So I just kind of told all my students, promote it. I'm doing this thing on Mondays, right, when the museum isn't open, tell people, see if people are interested, promote it on your social media channels, because this is like 2016, right? And I was really close to and had really great relationships to the guest services staff, right, and the security staff at PAFA. Because I'm from a working class background, whenever I start my museum positions, I don't prioritize meeting donors and making relationships with donors first. I prioritize meeting the facility staff, the security staff, and the guest services staff, right? Because those are my folks, right? And so that's the way that I find out what's happening in Black and Brown communities in a city that I may not know anything about. And because I had those relationships with those staffers at PAFA, I was like, hey, I'm doing this thing. Administration really doesn't want it to happen. I think people are going to show up. Would you be willing, to let people in? And they were like, sure. So museum is closed. It's like 65 people show up to the first one, about 80 something people show up to the next one. By the time I got to the fourth one, it was like over 100 people. So PAFA's administration is like, how the hell is she getting all these people, through the door? And word, never really, don't take word of mouth, for granted, so this is why this essay is titled "There's More Than One Way to Skin a Cat," right? Or a museum, or in this case, a painting, in its museum, because there's always ways, right, that you can kind of get around the institution's quote unquote rules, to do what it is you really want to have, what it is you really want to do. And part of that is really knowing what you really want to do, who you want to do it with, right, and who you're doing it for. Sometimes I like to call it surgery, right? I use, surgical analogies sometimes, where it's like you have to know how to wield your own scalpel, in a way, right, where they bled out before the institution realizes that you even cut them. And part of that, again, is like knowing what your own interests are, because in implementing a lot of these types of interventions, you have to also be aware. So like I was saying in the piece I just shared, right? It's like, sit back and watch for a minute, see how you have to see how the leadership moves. You have to see how the institution works. I sometimes describe it as like burying yourself in the walls, right? Or like observing the institution from underneath the floors. So you can actually see how things move, so that you can identify the holes through which you can navigate through, right? So that's just one of several interventions, right, that I've done. And you can go to my website and read about more of them, or you can, I always kind of hate saying this, but like you can search me on YouTube and a lot of different talks and conversations that I've had, right, about some of my other ones, you will find there, and even strategies, that I've laid out before as well.
Thank you. We have a next question from Logan. What is your advice to someone who wants to speak up in museums, academia, but does not necessarily have the power to make change?
So in that way, it's like you have to really reconcile with yourself that it's not going to, right? Structural change, and some of my colleagues, disagree with me on this too. I don't think we're going to see the structural changes that we really need in our lifetime, right? I think you all will, right? Because, I'm probably 20 to 25 years older, right, than most of you. Not that I'm like super old, but you see what I'm getting at. You have to reconcile with yourself that it's not going to change, right? But speaking up in the moment where it matters absolutely has to happen. There were so many times, now I've gotten to a place where I'm like, choose your battles, because it happens so much. Sometimes you can't take it on all the time. And so you have to say, okay, I think I'm gonna let that one go today, depending on how you feel, because it's heavy. But sometimes when there are certain things that are just really egregious, you have to say something. I was always, sort of convicted, right? Where it's like, I could not say anything. But I had also reconciled with myself that like, even me saying something, is not necessarily going to change it structurally, but it will change the way this person, right, reacts or will think twice, before saying something like that again. There have been times where I've spoke up where, like I said, didn't necessarily change it structurally, but it definitely changed the structure of a particular meeting, right? Certain things that were quote unquote normalized, then became, oh, okay, we can't do that like that anymore. And part of it was also like, well, we can't do that anymore because Kelly's a problem. You also, sometimes they will disinvite you, right? Like the meeting will just fall off your calendar, or they'll shut you out of things. But it really is about, what you feel, right, is what you feel convicted about, and what you feel is really is important to say something about. I tell my students all the time, so much of this work is really about you, and the field will gaslight you, to make you like through this sort of fictive narrative of objectivity, that really is a lie, so you really have to know what you stand for, and stand on that and let that be enough for you versus the institution's kind of fictive mission. A lot of this DEI talk, right, and these mission statements and vision statements are just that, statements, because it's what they're supposed to say, and so this is why I always say it's really important to know what you stand for.
Thank you for that response. That one's got me. Our next question is from JY. And thank you for sharing how your personal life and curatorial work are interconnected. In your years of experience, have you noticed any generational shifts in your field or within museums?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of, one of the reasons why I'm still in it, is because of you all. I think Gen Zers, younger millennials, you're coming out of your degree programs, and coming into institutions, whether it's traditional encyclopedic institutions or contemporary institutions. And you're like, what is this? I'm not doing any of this. Right. Whereas the generation above me is kind of like on autopilot. Right. And so that pushing against the structures. And it was a eye-opening moment for me, because so many of, like I said, that generation before me, and even my own constituency, where we kind of know, right, and we kind of have these ways around. Your generation doesn't know, right? Like, doesn't know what you're walking into, and then you walk into the place and you're like, what the hell? So I was like, okay, well, how can I bring, both demographics together? So that's what I'm doing in my program at Tufts with the graduate curriculum. It's kind of bringing both demographics together to like learn from each other. Yeah. So the generational shift is absolutely there. I think museums are really struggling with that, at the leadership level too, because they're becoming obsolete. In terms of that, like, cultural importance. There were so many, younger museum professionals who just said, I'm not doing any of this. I much rather, be a barista at Starbucks, or I much rather like work at a grocery store, because you all are very adamant about being cared for, right? And not being in toxic work situations. You're not going to sit and take it, right, in the way that the generations before you have been kind of trained to. So there was a shift in the workforce, where institutions couldn't necessarily fill positions. Even at my level, there was a moment in right before the pandemic into 2021, where there were like 24, 25 museum director positions open across the country. And for, again, like my constituency, so those of us who should be like primed or experienced, right, to go into those positions, were like, no, ma'am. No, thank you. And I can tell you personally, I got about 5 headhunts and I was like, no, thank you. So across the board, my constituency, so those of us that are in our like early 40s, like early to mid 40s, we're like, I don't want to be no director. I'm not dealing right with all that stuff. And that was shocking, for the search firms, as well as trustees, right? As boards of trustees that were like, okay, we really got to make some changes, because there was no plan B. There was no sense that culture would shift. There was no preparation, for us as a generation. Like, I consider myself like a old millennial, right? A young Gen Xer. So from my generation to you guys, there was no sense of like us not just wanting to kind of come in and be a part of the stat quo, right, of the institution. And museums are really struggling with that. So you see, again, all of these really bad mess ups, right, that are going on. And then these sort of like recanting, or like, we're gonna try to fix, we're gonna hire the DEI firm, or we're gonna do this work, because they're not gonna be able to keep us. Right. And they know that. And so when, whenever, students ask me, or, just different audiences go like, well, why have you been in it? And it's just so hard and it's so bad. And I'm like, because a lot of us can't just leave it. It's like, I'm here for those, who have to be in it. Not everybody can work independently. The institutions aren't going anywhere, anytime soon. And not a lot of people will tell you the truth, about the dynamics. That's another reason why I continue to do it. Because I call it exotic chicken syndrome, where you will literally be in a meeting or be in a space and it's clearly a duck, and it ain't just a duck, it's a mallard duck. And everybody in the room will tell you it's a genetically modified chicken, and it's like, you have to be able to like recognize that in those moments. Because I can't tell you across the board how many people, reach out to me, Black, BIPOC, right, queer, who are just like, thank you so much, because I thought I was crazy. I was so happy, when I saw your TED Talk, or I read this essay, or, saw this YouTube video, because I thought I was crazy. And I'm like, nope, you're not crazy. It's the thing that is very real, about art institutions that isn't talked about in a very honest, truthful, and open way.
Dr. Morgan, could I ask a sort of follow-up? Do you feel like your work you're doing now as an educator is maybe preparing people to move into the profession and help to bring about the kind of change that obviously needs to happen?
Yes, because I feel like, David, like, and I've had this conversation with people at various levels, in the field. It's like, we're like, because the issue is really a trustee issue.
Yeah.
Like, it really is, it's a built-in conflict of interest, right? That's a whole nother story. But we're trying to kind of galvanize the middle, because the funders, particularly Ford and Mellon, have like caught on, right? Where they're just like, oh my God, yeah, we didn't actually prime the institutions. So this is why you see these $25 million grants that Mellon and Ford has given, for Latinx art and Black art and all these different things, because they get it now. So through the field, like, I'm trying to do it right through an actual like course curriculum. I have other colleagues like Mia Locks, and Makita Best and Liz Munsell, who are, and several other people, who are running museums moving forward, who are just trying to like lay out the data, right? To say, we all know this is happening. Here's the data that proves, what it looks like. I think of folks like, Latanya Autry and, Mike Morawski, who are doing similar work, right? Who are teaching, because we're like, this is the stuff we're going to have to fight. So you have to know the art history side of it. But you also have to know these sort of white supremacist colonial histories, how to recognize, their contemporary manifestations. So I have a course called Art, Whiteness, and Empire, right, that walks people through that history. I have a course called Anti-Racist Approaches to Curatorial Practice, that presents like Black feminist, decolonial, post-colonial, civil rights, Black grassroots frameworks, as a model, for how to apply those theories and those frameworks to like their basic everyday job functions. So whether you're a registrar, a conservator, a curator, right, wherever you are in the institution, I'm actually kind of reworking that class to make it a bit more specific. But those are definitely, things that I'm like honed in on. And it's another reason why I'm taking the break this summer, because I need to like revamp it. To make it a bit more specific. But that was really my thought, David. It was like, okay, well, how can I teach it? Because museum studies doesn't, art history kind of doesn't.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you as well. I have another question for you. Catherine White, because you spend a lot of time discussing white supremacy in museum spaces, are there certain things you tend to notice or stick out to you when visiting a museum for the first time?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes it's, well, I'm gonna be honest, lately I haven't gone to any, because doing this work has become very traumatic, right? So I've been out of institutions for maybe about a year and a half. Because I definitely do, right, notice it. It's in the architecture, it's in the design. I would, another thing I can share is I have a really hard time now, walking through, African galleries, right, or indigenous pre-Columbian galleries. That whole like darkness, typically they're in the basement, right? For instance, I'm in Detroit right now with my mother, but I live in Boston, right, work at Tufts. So the Boston MFA, bottom floor, right, of their American wing is so problematic. But it's like it's a door that you walk through, right? Like when you enter the gallery, but it's like 3 different rooms, right? The middle room goes from like Inca, Mayan, all the way up to kind of present day Native American, but it is flanked on both sides. On the right side, it's the museum's collection of like warship models. So same length, right, of gallery, And it's like all colonial warship models. And it's this whole thing of like, oh, these beautiful models, right? And then there's this narrative of like, oh, it's really interesting that we have this great collection of warship models. And I'm like, it's New England. Where do you think all that cotton was going? From the South. What do you think it was actually like lending itself to, in the textile industry that is absolutely like directly related to the damn maritime industry. Right? You don't have these ship models like for like just out of the damn blue, right? And so then on the other side, though, it's the entire collection of like American silver. So now all of this Native American, right, indigenous land that you've raised and all this genocide, right, that is the colonial American story. Here's the wealth of silver that has come back, into the country, or back into like the economy, right, from doing that through these damn warship models, right? And it's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I have a very visceral reaction now, matter of fact, I was supposed to like actually do a video for my Art, Whiteness, and Empire class in those spaces, with some MFA staffers, who are also aware of like how problematic, right, that floor is. And I just couldn't, like, I just didn't have, I didn't have the capacity, like the psychoemotive capacity, because it's like you can just feel the pain of it all, and it's like, this is the problem with curation, right? It's just like, how do curators not get that? I get sometimes it's, space is an issue and, the whole nine, but I'm just like, yo, right? You have literally like caged, your indigenous and Native American objects within the two most quintessential violent colonial like object collections, you possibly, like, other than maybe having like a gun collection. It's like, it's so bad, so it's stuff like that, that I have to be, that I'm totally aware of, now, and aware of like the effects that it has. So I can't, it's like certain things I just can't kind of touch anymore, which is another reason why I was like, I need a break. Just to be totally transparent with you, I was in Chelsea a couple weeks ago, just at Gagosian Gallery, like trying, my best to check out some BIPOC shows. And it was like just the commodification, of all Black everything, right? Black art, Black people, Black culture. I had a complete and utter meltdown, was just like crying and was like, I just can't. So that was a moment, where I was like, I can't do this anymore. I have to step away, because I've been in it, for so long. I've been combating it, for so long, to a certain degree, not completely by myself, but also like in isolation. And so it's hard for me to take, like my friends who work in anthropology, I don't know how they do it, because it's like, you can feel it, when you're really connected to it, in a genuine way. And so, yeah, I definitely see it, and I've been kind of staying away from it recently.
Thank you for that response. I'm glad you are taking time for yourself. Like, that is very important. We have another question from Rachel. Do you have any suggestions for educators hoping to encourage students to speak their minds and confront injustices, fostering a safe space in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about autonomy. It's like one thing that, that I didn't realize till I was like 36, but that my elementary school teachers did, was really allow us to, trust our own sense, of self and what we knew, and gave us the space, to speak up and speak back, and at that time it was like kind of what was happening right in our own homes and in our own communities. But more so than anything, to do that is teaching students how to trust themselves. I have a student, a graduate student right now who I love to death, who doesn't necessarily mean like any harm, but she apologizes before she says any and everything. Right. And I'm always like, stop apologizing. So it's like little, like you can catch sometimes, students will have little quirks, right? Right. Like that. It's just her own feeling of like deference is what she has to lead with, right? Because she's a woman of color. And who knows, right, where she picked that up, right, along the line of her socialization. And I'm constantly saying, stop apologizing. You don't have to apologize to say, what it is you have to say. Another thing, that I've noticed, Rachel, in my courses, with this generation in particular, right, because they're kind of like the No Child Left Behind generation. So there's a lot of silence because they don't want to say the wrong thing, right? Or they, so it's like, what's the right answer? And I'm always like, the answer. You have to trust that I thought that was like a really interesting phenomenon over the last like 5 years of teaching, where they're so nervous, to say anything. And most of the time they're right. Like what they're thinking is actually the right thing. And so finding ways to affirm them before they even speak, is another way, to do that. Because speaking up, against injustice is not a very different thing, but it's like a deeper kind of greater thing than just speaking up at all. And so you first have to affirm them, to speak up in the first place, right? And to trust that they, as my mom would say, that they know what they know, what they know.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. I have a question as we conclude and, kind of put the bow on top. I will ask we're talking about coloring outside the lines, and you talked about your background. How do you feel about this digital landscape that is now totally involving art history, digital humanities in the 21st century? As a current graduate student, I find myself really interested in ways that digital initiatives are able to do what physical spaces and museums have not been able to. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's amazing. Like I just discovered maybe like 2-3 months ago, Maggie, are you familiar with the unfiltered history tours for the British Museum? And it's like an app, right? Where,
Okay.
I don't know if you have to download it, but anyway, it literally it tours you through, right, all of the stolen objects, right, in the British Museum's collection. And it's so funny because I talk to people in London all the time and I ask people about it and it's like crickets. Nobody wants to talk about it, so it's like those type of things, are really important. I just wrote a piece for Hyperallergic about neoclassical sculpture, and reading it through like Black feminist scholarship, and doing a similar kind of thing, like what happens, if this was engaged, through a digital interactive, or like in a virtual way, that puts the sculpture, in conversation with the material culture that contextualizes it, right, in its contemporaneous moment, that tells more of the story of Black women, because I'm always like, Ammonia Lewis may have been the only neoclassical sculptor, but she wasn't the only Black woman in neoclassical sculpture affected, right? And so I think those things are really necessary now, because I like to say museums are freight trains, right, or aircraft carriers. They're not sports cars. So even just to implement something like that at some place at like the Met would take like 5 years, to like make it happen in a gallery, or to incorporate it fully, right, into institutional functionality would take forever. Versus, you can construct it and develop it as an app, or in a digital format, and sometimes less than 6 months. And then and actually doing so gives more people more access, right, to it. So I do think that's a really important tool, for us to employ. I think we actually have to, because I'm like getting these institutions, to move physically, is sometimes like pulling teeth.
Yes, definitely. I would, on behalf of everyone who has joined us today, KU's Art History Department, and everyone involved in you so graciously speaking with us tonight in your lecture, we want to say thank you. I hope everyone who has showed up and viewed this talk today has left with more than they came in with, and you have allowed a new insight into thinking about how we move forward and thinking about art in the 21st century, especially as graduate students, undergraduate students, and even outside of that realm of the academic environment. I hope that, this will lead to more people being engaged and keeping into what you're up to. You mentioned your book, so definitely be on the lookout for that. I'm excited about that. I think.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Yeah, I'm praying that I can get one of them that be out by the end of the year. Museum overhaul will probably be another. Yeah, but will probably be the rest of this year. But my website's in the chat. I'm also These Museum Streets on Instagram. And I'm pretty active, on Instagram these days. I kind of go off and on, but this has been an active month. So you can find a lot of this stuff, a lot more about what I've done over the years, and what I'm doing currently on my IG page. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We definitely are going to look more into your work and continue to learn from you. We appreciate how much you shared with us this evening. Want to invite everyone back on April 20th for our next speaker, Lara C.W. Blanchard of Hobart and William Smith College. Kelli Morgan, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time this evening and everything that you've taught us and the inspiration that you've brought us. And we wish you a wonderful summer of rejuvenation and moving ahead strong.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. Thank you to everybody for spending your evening with me. This was really wonderful. It was wonderful to meet everybody. And it was just great, to spend this time with